This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Leer Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind, with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas, of all types and vocations, who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a political geographer at Ben Gurion University of the Negev and the author of a new book entitled This is No Africa, Boundaries, Territory, Identity, that was recently published in Hebrew by the Leer Institute, and its English edition, Israel and Africa, A Genealogy of Moral Geography, has been published in English by Routledge roughly at the same time. The book offers an analysis of how Israel's political and conceptual relationship with the African continent over the years contributed to the shaping of its own space and identity. Professor Haim Yacobi, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, thank you for the invitation.
Many in Israel, as well as elsewhere, see Israel as a Western outpost in the East, a villa in the jungle, as it was neatly described by our former Prime Minister Ehud Barak. This assertion has been challenged by pointing out all sorts of phenomena, whereby the Middle East is more than present in Israel in many regards. After all, this is the region where this country is geographically located. It is our neighborhood. But Africa? Africa is next door, very near, but far away enough to keep at arm's length. So my question to you, by way of introduction, is really how present would you say Africa has been in the Israeli space? And I mean space, I'm asking you about the space as a geographer, both physical and conceptual.
I think it's a very good question that was also the main question that triggered me to start this research. I think in the last decade or so, we can see more and more African people in our streets, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, in Arad, wherever. And these people are coming as migrants or as refugees or asylum seekers. They come to Israel and they've changed, I think, quite dramatically the demographic landscape, but also I think the way in which we as Israelis, the way in which we look at these people and learn something about ourselves.
Mm-hmm. But it's not a recent phenomenon. As you show in your book, it goes way before that.
Exactly. So the fascination on one hand, and I would also say the very racist attitude towards these black migrants triggered me very much to understand how Africa, not just as a geopolitical or a geographical entity, but also as an idea, has been constructed, developed, and transformed during the last 60, 70 years, I would say. So it's quite clear, and I will not go into more details about it, that, the whole idea of establishing a Jewish colony in East Africa, what is well known as the Uganda Plan, this is part of our historical story, and I think every third person in the street knows something about it. But what I found fascinating and very, very interesting is that Israel was heavily involved in Africa in the 60s, from the end of the 50s till the mid-70s. So this chapter in history was not very well studied, I would say. And when researchers, some other colleagues of mine, wrote about this period and about Israeli involvement in Africa, but I think they looked at it in a very, I would say, rational way. What were the interests of Israel in Africa in the 60s?
It was studied as a political question or a strategic question. Not a cultural one.
Yeah, it was, what are the geostrategic interests of Israel in Africa? And of course, they are right. There were some very good reasons to be involved in Africa. But what I was interested is in the culture, in the production of culture, architecture, development, and planning in Africa in the 60s. And I think it is a very interesting period because one should understand that at the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, Israel was, after one decade of very extensive development. And many of Israel's architects, planners, experts of development moved to work in Africa as part of the wider Israeli involvement in the continent.
That was really widespread. It had, as we said, a strategic and political rationale behind it. And as you say in your book, this relationship, you focus on the way it influenced Israel. You say in your book, the book is not about Africa, it's about Israel. So how did these things that were on the macro level at the end of the day, all sorts of companies, governmental companies going to Africa to work and invest and develop it, how did it trickle down to the cultural realm, the all-Israeli being?
So there were several, I would say, channels towards this. One should understand that we're talking about two directions, from Israel to Africa and also from Africa to Israel. So we can see that beyond the very extensive construction, planning and design of buildings, settlements, and some other projects in Africa by Israeli architects, we can also see how, for example, the Israeli public, what kind of education Israeli public had to get in order to understand this involvement. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in the book, I'm writing in a very, of course, I would say critical way on two art exhibitions that were in Tel Aviv in 1960 and 1964 that presented African primitive art. And when one reads the catalogs of these exhibitions and the media coverage of these exhibitions, it is very clear that Africa was presented as primitive in order to construct Israeli identity as modern. Mm-hmm. So this kind of contradiction between Africa as black, backward, primitive, and Israel as white, modern, and so on and so forth, we can see that different cultural mechanisms were very crucial in order to construct this image. Mm-hmm. Not just, so when I write in the book that this book is not about Africa, but about Israel, that's exactly what I mean. How Africa was used as an object in order to develop Israeli identity.
Mm-hmm. But also to show, to a certain extent, the veracity or the effectiveness of the project, because Africa was a vast terra incognita, some sort of uncharted waters for the Zionist project, to show them during the era of decolonization how an agricultural revolution that is tied with a national revolution could work the same that it had done for Israel a few decades before.
Absolutely. For example, in the book, I mentioned an African leader who came to Israel, and he was fascinated by the development of the country. And this fascination has to do with modernization, of course, but also with the fact that Israel, one could argue or one could agree or disagree with it, but the territorial revolution in Israel from 1948 was a miracle. A new territory has been produced, and it was a very important model for the new African states. Mm-hmm. That on one hand, they were fascinated by the Israeli new geography. On the other hand, they really...
Well, what do you mean exactly by new geography?
So the fact that Israel became, a Jewish territory, majority Jewish territory, we're talking about the development towns, we're talking about the kibbutzim, we're talking about Nachal settlements. All these forms of settlements had not just a territorial objective, but also were a mechanism of transforming identity. So when African leaders came and saw the development towns or the kibbutzim, they understood that this model of development could be very relevant to their countries. And it's very clear from the archival work I've done that they really wanted to have the Israeli model. On the other hand, they didn't want to have any European colonial or previously colonial power intervening in their states. So Israel was a very good model, but it was also a political solution to the tension between the colonized states and the previous colonizers.
So pretty much the same ambivalence that Israel had vis-a-vis the West existed also in Africa.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yes. And I think it's also important to mention that Israel we have to look at it also in the wider context of the Cold War, because Israel was, at the end of the day, Israel was an arm of the United States in Africa. So resources were transferred to Israel to invest in Africa.
As early as the 1950s and 60s?
No, I'm talking about, mid-50s till the mid-70s. So one should also see this kind of global context. It's very important, but Israel was a very effective arm because it was a very good model.
Mm-hmm. The theoretical framework with which you tackle this issue that also appears in the title of your book in English is moral geography. What can you tell us about that?
Moral geography is, if to be, very, I'll try to be clear about it, but moral geography is the way in which we, as a society, justify our involvement in territory, in space. And I'm not talking about, political justification or instrumental justification. I'm talking about moral justification. In a very simple way, I'll put it. Is it good or bad? Are we doing something good or are we doing something bad? And my argument is that Israel developed rational or moral geographies in order to justify its involvement in Africa. That has to do with, issues of race, of color, of blackness and whiteness, modernization, etc., etc. And unfortunately, this term was very much used in the geographical discourse in the 70s, 80s for a short period, and then it disappeared. But I find it very relevant, not just, to understand Israeli involvement in Africa, but even Israeli involvement in the occupied territories or Israeli involvement in the unrecognized villages of the Bedouins in the Negev.
Mm-hmm. But how does geography really come into play here? At the end of the day, it's a political question, trying to understand what the overlap between politics and geography in this sense is.
I think this is exactly the difference maybe between my work and, the work of people who are doing politics or culture. I'm very interested in the real material world, in the way in which territory is changed physically, tangibly, the way in which buildings shape our cities, in the way in which infrastructure is not just a technical or instrumental tool, but also a political tool. So the fact that the book very much focuses on architecture, planning, development, has to do with my understanding of the way in which the physical, the territorial reality is not an illustration to the big politics, but this is politics.
Mm-hmm. The Israeli honeymoon in Africa reached an abrupt end in the early to mid-70s after the Yom Kippur War and the exacerbation of the bipolar tensions during the Cold War, where basically Africa was recruited to the Soviet orbit at the expense of Israel. How much was this really a breaking point?
It was a very dramatic breaking point. In the book, I mention, for example, a document that I found in the archive of the Ministry of Education sent to teachers in different schools in Israel in order to read the students and explain to students that, we have no relationship now with Africa. In a way, the document justified again the moral geography of Israel in Africa, or the step back that Israel took from Africa, and blaming the African states as those who preferred the Arab world or the Russian side on the Israeli side. Mm-hmm. So it was very dramatic, I must say. I was surprised to find this kind of document because one could see that during the 70s and the 60s, many school books were published on Africa, in geography, for example. So it is very important to mention it because I think the reaction gives us a good indication on the importance of these relationships.
Mm-hmm. And there were Israelis in Africa, and you analyze some of those texts in your book, who came back with their, say, cultural baggage. How did they manage to translate it, really, into the Israeli discourse? Give us a few examples.
If I understand correctly your question, many Israelis served in Africa. When they returned back to Israel, there were several significant, I would say, issues here. First of all, most of the people that I interviewed, they really liked Africa. Africa was for them, a great experience. They stayed there for 3, 5 years, and even 10 years, doing either private business or working for the different Israeli companies. When they returned back to Israel, I've just heard today when I gave a lecture in the morning, they brought, all these sculptures and artifacts of African art back to Israel. And in the 70s, for example, this kind of, in the big, in the Mashbir and the Shechem, all these department stores, all these objects were sold to the Israeli public, again, as a way to educate us. This is primitive, it's not like us, but it's very exotic, it has a value, etc., etc. So I'm not so sure that I understood your question, but that's the answer.
It does answer it very neatly. I'd like to take, fast forward a bit or rewind to the beginning of this conversation when we were talking about the actual presence of Africa on the Israeli street today, which didn't exist before, with two groups that are completely separate and distinguishable, but still are present here, the asylum seekers from Africa and the Ethiopian Jewish community. Now, unlike before, we can say that Africa is present in Israel. What can you say about that? How did it change things?
Yeah. I think that, it's clear that the migration of Ethiopian Jews to Israel was a very significant step in the way in which, black people were part of us. Of course, as you probably know, there was a very racist attitude towards the Ethiopian Jews, questioning their Jewishness, questioning their health conditions, etc., etc. But I think that the turning point was very much the African asylum seekers, that at the very beginning, when they've just arrived to Israel, they were very welcome. And many of the organizations and the public discourse was very much comparing the African refugees to us, Jewish refugees. And these kind of similarities were very much in the front. However, as time passed and this migration became more and more significant, we can see how racist discourse is produced around it. The way in which the fact that they are black, mainly men, walking in our streets. So I would say that the presence of the African refugees brought into the surface a more racist attitude towards Africa.
But also, conversely, it brought to the Israeli landscape areas that are completely, almost entirely black.
Yeah, and I think that's why the title of the book in Hebrew is This is Not Africa, because this is Africa. Israel is geographically linked to Africa. I mean, theoretically, I could walk from here, Tel Aviv, to Addis.
Which some people did.
And some refugees are doing it. But I think that what is very important in this context is to understand that the arrival of African refugees has to do with the question of Israeli boundaries and borders, because the borders, the fortification of Israel and the border with Egypt these days was very much focused on, stopping the arrival of African refugees. Later it became because of security reasons. I would claim that there are many other reasons for that. But what is very important is to see how the border is dynamic. Sometimes it is blocked and closed to refugees. But as I write in the last chapter of the book, sometimes it is very open for Israeli businessmen and armed traders doing, some deals in Africa. So when I'm talking about boundaries, I'm not just talking about geopolitical or geographical boundaries. I'm also talking about, the flow of capital, the flow of knowledge of experts from Israel to Africa. And I think we have to see these phenomena in parallel. The fortification of Israel on one hand, but the opening of these borders on the other hand.
Mm-hmm. One last question, and very briefly, because we're running out of time, please. Is Israel unique in this sense, as opposed to Europe, let's say, that also maintains some sort of relationship with Africa, again, with its own historical baggage of colonization, etc.? There is, especially France, has this idea of this community of nations in Africa that is related to France. Are the modalities different there, or are we generally talking about the same kind of relationship?
Of course, there are differences stemming from different historical, geographical, economic contexts. I mean, there are many differences, and the connection between the colonized and the colonizers. So I think in Israel, the situation is different because Israel as a settler society was established with the logic of creating a unified, homogeneous community. And throughout the book, I'm trying to question it. The arrival of North African Jews to Israel is part of the question mark on the whiteness of Israeli society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but aren't North African Jews or North Africans in general are considered in Israel, in the West, as African? I think that we're talking mainly about Sub-Saharan Africa.
We're talking mainly about Sub-Saharan Africa, but I think, and this is our argument that many people don't like, I think that we should see how in the same years that Israel excluded North African Jews were the years that Israel was trying to educate Israeli public how Africa is exotic and beautiful. So I think, again, these two parallel processes are very interesting because they were parallel.
And they were steeped in politics, of course, and that's where they came from. I'm afraid this is all we have time for. Professor Haim Yacobi, a political geographer at Ben Gurion University of the Negev and author of the newly published book, Israel and Africa, a genealogy of moral geography. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thanks.
And also big thanks to Alex Benish, the sound engineer, and to the Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick.
רועד בוקע ממיתרים נשפך כן נגן כינור נגן שיריך מרב החושך והשקט סביב